Hi, everyone, and welcome to Lecture 10 of Logic and Critical Thinking. In this lecture, we'll take a look at relevance fallacies. So at this point in the course, we've finished the first three sections, and so we are then going down the home stretch of the course, so to speak. This will be the start of section 4, again, the final section of the course. And in this section, we will basically be just cataloging, much like we cataloged the rhetorical devices in the previous lecture, the final lecture of section 3, where we talked about rhetoric. We will basically be offering a massive catalog, if you will, of all kinds of different fallacies. And so fallacies, as we'll learn here early on in this lecture, is mistaken reasoning, and these mistakes are so common. Us humans, we err so frequently that logicians then have names for these various ways of making mistakes. And there are so many different ways, right, that we have a lot of them to cover. And so I think I don't think anything in the course really compares in terms of difficulty to section 2 and what we've already done. And this is no exception, compared to that. I think it's, relatively straightforward. But if there is anything that can kind of make this section, difficult, it would be the volume, the sheer volume, the number of different types of fallacies we'll discuss. And so I think, again, like many things in this course, what will help with that is just practice, practice, practice. And they do offer ample, exercises and problems at the end of each of these chapters to do precisely that, to get your practice in. So, by the way, this lecture 10 then corresponds to chapter 6 of the 13th edition if you're taking the course. So, again, I think most of this is going to be pretty straightforward. We'll give examples. We'll go through each of the different kinds. So you might think section 4, we're dealing with fallacies. And so in this lecture 10, we're going to dial in, and we'll say more on this in the first 2 slides of this lecture, but we're going to dial in on what we'll call relevance fallacies. And then, so that might be one heading under fallacies. And then in lecture 11, which corresponds to chapter 7, we'll discuss induction fallacies. Fallacies related to inductive kinds of arguments, or what the person thinks they're offering is an inductive argument. The idea is, well, they're making mistakes somewhere therein, right? And then in the final lecture, another heading, if you will, under fallacies would be what we'll call, the lecture is called other fallacies, and basically it's just all the other types that don't fall under those first 2 headings. And in general, they're kind of formal fallacies or fallacies related to language. And so again, that corresponds to chapter 8 of the textbook. And so everything we talk about in section 4, the general theme is, again, it's going to deal with fallacies or mistake. One way or another, the person offering the so-called argument is in one way or another engaged in a mistake. And hopefully, conversely, right, we as listeners or readers, however we're coming across whatever's being said, we want to then avoid falling for the same mistake. Right? So hopefully that kind of gives you a general idea of what we are going to be up to in this 4th and final section of the course, again, talking about all kinds of different ways we can make mistakes as critical thinkers, or that other people can make mistakes, and that we as critical thinkers can, realize that they're making these mistakes, identify those mistakes, maybe call it to their attention, maybe not, who knows, depending on the situation. But in any case, right, identify the mistakes ourselves and not, as I like to say, be unduly swayed by whatever's being said. So, again, that's what we're up to in general in terms of section 4. I intimated kind of what we'll be up to in this particular lecture, lecture 10, which again corresponds to chapter 6. But let's go ahead then and dive into this lecture on relevance fallacies then. And the first thing we'll do in the lecture, turning to slide 2 then, is basically recapitulate what I just mentioned in terms of what we're up to in the 4th and final section, and then so that'll be the slide 2, and then slide 3 gets into our particular type of fallacy that we're going to be dealing with in this particular chapter. And by the way, I know there's a lot on the board, and I apologize for that. But on the flip side, I did get everything we'll discuss, the entire catalog of relevance fallacies that we'll be discussing. I got up here on the board, and I like having that visually for you guys. And here in a moment, I think in case I need to jot anything else down, I'll probably erase the top part here, give us a little room. But again, this question I thought would be good to kind of start us off with, what are we concerned with in this section? Already mentioned in general fallacies, right? And that's going to be addressed in slide 2, and then slide 3. What are we particularly concerned with in this chapter, or this lecture, you might say? And again, the answer is going to be relevance fallacies, and we will flesh that out in more detail in slide 3. Okay, so again, turning our attention to slide 2. From the 10th edition, page 184, the authors reflect on changing times, saying, quote, "As it becomes more difficult to find a serious discussion of an important issue, it gets easier and easier to find examples of rhetorical devices designed to provoke emotional, knee-jerk reactions," end quote. And we talked all about rhetoric in the previous lecture, lecture 9. So go back and, if you need to, go back and review that to get your dose, if you will, of all those different ways we can be unduly swayed, as I like to say, by those rhetorical types of devices. Now, the middle bullet point there in slide 2, what differentiates then what we're going to be doing in this entire section from what we already talked about in the previous, that lecture 9 on rhetoric? Well, as opposed to the last chapter, in this chapter, as I mentioned in this bullet point, right, in this chapter we focus on rhetoric that takes on the actual guise of an argument, right? So in the previous lecture chapter, right, all those devices, the person using them or employing them wasn't suggesting that they were actually offering an argument. Well, here in all these cases, the ones we'll go through henceforth in this fourth and final section, the person is suggesting that they're offering an argument, or that they're refuting what someone else is saying from a logical perspective, when in fact they're not. Right? So there is that intimation or suggestion that they are offering an argument or countering someone else's argument, right? But they have something on offer from a logical perspective, one way or another, when in fact they don't. Right? So that element was missing from the purely rhetorical devices we discussed in the previous lecture. Right? There was no suggestion of an argument being at play. So that was the middle bullet point on slide 2. The idea is we're guilty of a fallacy, okay, which most generally, and I suggested this earlier, fallacy in general it denotes a mistaken reasoning in one shape or form. And so then as logicians, and in particular in this class then, or in this course, we're going to be usually when a fallacy is afoot, right, it has to deal one way or another with an argument or a lack thereof. All right, so that's kind of what I'm getting at, the bottom bullet point on slide 2. So if we take what really isn't an argument to be an argument, that's a mistake. We don't want to do that. Of course, a lot of times people will be suggesting they're offering an argument when they're not. And so again, we want to be able to recognize when that is the case. Okay? And so too, I should say, we want to be able to recognize when an argument's not as good as it's suggested to be. Okay? So that's what I mean by, or lend more credence to a bad argument. As they say, quote, "an argument that doesn't really support or prove the contention it is supposed to support or prove," end quote. We want to be on guard against situations where that's the case, okay, in general. So turning to slide 3 then, so we've answered our top question then, right? What differentiates what we're doing now and henceforth from what we just did in the previous lecture? The person offering or engaged in these rhetorical devices is also, right, from this point forward, they think they are doing something from a logical perspective, right? They're offering an argument or they're countering someone else's argument, okay? And in fact, they're not doing that. And that's what is different then from the previous lecture, again, where they were just engaged in rhetorical devices without that suggestion or implication that they were refuting someone else's argument or offering their own argument in the process. And so hopefully that point's established at this point. Okay, so turning to slide 3 then, the second question, what are we specifically dealing with? Granted, we're dealing with fallacies or mistakes in reasoning, which typically, right, in our context, has to do with arguments. Granted, we're dealing with those kinds of things. What particular fallacies are we going to be dealing with in this lecture, in this particular chapter, chapter 6? In this lecture, lecture 10. Again, what is the general heading? Well, relevance fallacies. So the top of top bullet point on slide 3 what all the fallacies in this chapter have in common is the, quote, fact that what pretends to be a premise is actually irrelevant to the conclusion, end quote. And that was actually from page 185 of the 10th edition. So let me get some space up here. So the general idea, right, we remember from, what was that, lecture 2? I think we introduced this. In an argument, you need two basic things, right? A conclusion, which is establishing a position on an issue. Then you also need at least one, if not many, a reason or a premise. Premises or reasons for taking this conclusion. Okay? And the idea is, with respect to all the fallacies or mistakes that we are dealing with in this particular lecture and then chapter 6 that corresponds to, is that these are not related, right? Whoever's offering whatever it is we're reading or listening to, they think they have offered us an argument, right? And given us something that supports this, but in fact, what they've offered us isn't really a premise at all, or isn't really a reason at all from a logician's perspective. Instead, they've just conjured up certain feelings, for example. We'll get into that type of relevance fallacy towards the end of the lecture. Okay, so underneath our general, the whole idea here is as well, that underneath our general heading of relevance fallacies, which we're getting into here, then we have all kinds of subtypes as well, and then even sub-subtypes, which we'll get into. Okay? So hopefully you're kind of getting that idea at this point. But again, what are we dealing with in particular? Granted, we're dealing with fallacies. What types of fallacies? Relevance fallacies. The issue here, the type of mistake being that whatever is thought to be offered in support of the conclusion actually has no relation to the conclusion, right? They're not related. They're not relevant to one another. And actually, I kind of take, I don't know why the final type, and I'm getting ahead of myself here, they call them irrelevant conclusions for sort of categorizing all the other types that don't fall into these. I think they could have just as easily said irrelevant premise, right? One way or another, the idea is that this is whatever they've given us for this doesn't have anything to do with this. They chose to call them irrelevant conclusions, all these other sort of types that don't fall conveniently in these categories. But I think you could have just as easily called it irrelevant premise, right? Because again, the whole idea with all these kinds of fallacies is that whatever they're offering us, right, is no good. Okay? Whether it be, right, just conjuring up certain emotions, that's not an actual reason for taking a position on an issue from a logician's perspective ever, right? The certain kinds of feelings, we talked about that at length in the previous lecture. Right? The feelings that might be conjured up, that's the problem with rhetoric, right? Is that it's all about conjuring up certain feelings. Those, strictly speaking, from a logician's perspective, have no bearing on the merits or demerits of arguments. Okay? So again, we need to be familiar with this sort of general type of mistake, right? That what is offered as a reason isn't really a reason, in the sense that it's not connected at all to the position they want us to take or the conclusion they want us to reach. So they're called relevance fallacies, aka red herrings. The authors mentioned this as well at the very beginning of the chapter. They're called red herrings because, again, herring is a type of fish that's really smelly and it can, right, distract hound dogs from their trail, completely, misleading them and leading them astray. And similarly, relevance fallacies, if we're not on guard, can get us to think that there's been convincing evidence provided when in fact there isn't, right? Then it's totally, irrelevant, and it's just meant to distract us and to buy into this for superfluous reasons, right? Reasons that aren't really reasons at all. They used to, actually, in previous editions, they would employ the term pseudo-reasoning, right? Because the idea is they haven't really offered us legitimate reasoning or evidence or a legitimate premise from a logician's perspective. I don't know why they stayed away from the pseudo talk in this particular edition, right? But they used to, and I like the way they put it, right? This pseudo reasoning, and they'd oftentimes refer to the arguments here as pseudo arguments, right? Because they're not really arguments. The whole idea is they're fallacies, they're mistakes. Okay? The person hasn't really given us a relevant reason that's related to the conclusion. Okay, so hopefully that's starting to make some sense. So from 185 of our own edition, the 13th edition, these kinds of fallacies, relevance fallacies, occur when an argument's, quote, premise is not relevant to the issue in question, end quote. Again, that's from page 185. And so they're again, focusing on the premise, right? So why not call these irrelevant premises, right? The whole idea is the premise isn't related to the conclusion or the issue that's at hand. So in other words, second bullet point from the bottom there, what appears to be a reason for accepting the conclusion argued for is in fact completely unrelated to that conclusion. So and the fallacy exists insofar as the person offering the argument thinks they've actually offered a legitimate argument. And also the fallacy also exists insofar as we buy into that if we do. So again, hopefully, being the critical thinkers we are, that won't happen, or at least won't happen anymore. Okay. So actually, before I get in then, so those are the preliminary, that's like the setup, if you will, for then us going ahead and diving into the catalog of not just fallacies, but in particular relevance fallacies, right? Getting into these various kinds. But before I turn to slide 4, I wanted to mention that you might notice then there's 7 general types of relevance fallacies, and that, not surprisingly, then corresponds for the homework. If you turn to page 200 of the 13th edition, right, you're supposed to, for all those problems, identify the fallacy that is most indicated in whatever is said, right? And there's 7 different options then. So those correspond, surprise, surprise, or not surprise, surprise, to these 7 headings then. Okay? So we'll be going through all these 7 options that then are the 7 possibilities you'll have for all the homework problems. Okay? So I just wanted to draw your attention to that those do correspond. Let's go ahead then, now that we have an idea of what we're up to here, and just dive in and start covering some of these fallacies. Let's start, as the authors do, with the most common relevance fallacy of all time, the one you'll encounter the most frequently, and that's Argumentum ad hominem. Now, I'm not going to call it that. I'm just going to call it an ad hominem or ad hominem fallacy. That's typically how you'll hear it referred to as. And the general theme with an ad hominem is that the person is suggesting they're addressing whatever the other person says, right, and their position on a matter. But really all the person's doing is drawing our attention to the person themselves and not their position or whatever it was they said from a logical perspective, right? And in drawing our attention to the person themselves, right, and typically saying something negative, not always, as we'll see, they suggest, erroneously, hence the fallacy, that they've then taken out whatever that person's position was from a logical perspective. No, you always have to go in and address what the person actually says, right? You can't dismiss. So one of my classic examples that I'll give in classes, imagine someone says, "Don't believe what Joe Blow says about the death penalty. He's an alcoholic father." Okay, not good to be an alcoholic father, let's say, or have any other negative character qualities, but that never gives you license to just immediately dismiss what the person says about, in this case, what was it, the death penalty or whatever it was, right? You always have to go in and analyze the merits of what they're saying, the arguments, right, in and of themselves. Right? And when the person instead is drawing our attention to the character of the person or the person for whatever reason, whether they're switching their view, that's one type of example we'll get it, the authors get into. Whatever the case is, if they're drawing our attention to some element or feature of the source of the argument, the person offering the argument, rather than the argument itself, that is what we mean to indicate then by ad hominem fallacies, or argument ad hominems. So this is the quote at the top of slide 4. This is coming from, the first part comes from page 210 of the 10th edition, and the second part comes from 186 of the 13th edition. This type of fallacy in general. So I've kind of characterized or tried to, what the fallacy is like in general, and we'll get into some specific versions, right? So subtypes of the subtype of the subtype, if you will, right? We'll get into some specific versions here as well here in a moment. But the general idea or the general type of fallacy, ad hominem fallacy, quote, rests on confusion between the qualities of the person making a claim and the qualities of the claim itself. And that was again from page 210 of the 10th edition. And, quote, you commit this fallacy if you think you dismiss someone's position or idea, proposal, claim, or argument, etc., by dismissing him or her, end quote. Now it's from 186 of the 13th edition. So imagine someone saying, everyone knows that philosophers are some strange cats. Therefore, you may as well ignore everything your instructor tells you in Philosophy 124. Nothing he or she says will warrant your attention. Okay, let's grant for the sake of argument that philosophers are some strange cats. Again, maybe that's not even a character flaw, but let's assume that it is a character flaw. You can't just dismiss something, or an argument that person's going to have, nevertheless, just because they have particular character flaws. You always have to look at the argument in and of itself, not to mention an entire class, right? What the person's going to say over an entire class. You have to judge what they say over the entire class. You can't just, again, immediately dismiss in this case, the philosophy instructor just because they're strange. You can't dismiss the merits of what they're going to say in their entire course. By the way, this would be actually an example of poisoning the well, right? It's future-oriented. It's trying to get us to dismiss, right, what the person's going to say in the future. And then another example right below that one. Quote, I don't care if I don't know what it is with these examples and professors and instructors, but I seem to employ these kinds of examples a lot. Anyway, I don't care if he's an economics professor. He's for the death penalty. Anybody that's unintelligent enough for a position like that can't have a very thought-provoking economic theory. Okay? Again, doesn't matter what their position is on some other issue. Okay? Or again, that's a kind of aspect of that character, right? The person offering the argument in this case on, what was it, the death penalty, right? You're, in this case, addressing not their argument on the death penalty, but instead some feature of their character, right? In this case, you are addressing, in this case, right, economic theory, their economic theory, and whether or not to be thought-provoking, right? And instead of addressing that, you're actually addressing a negative quality, what you take to be a negative quality of the person offering, right, the economic theory, namely their terrible position on the death penalty. He's for the death penalty, right? Well, again, that aspect of the character offering the economic theory has no bearing on the economic theory itself. You still have to assess, right, the economic theory that the economics professor is offering. Okay, so bottom bullet point, while the other facts about the person introducing a claim or an argument might lead us to question his or her credibility as a source, and we already addressed issues of credibility in a previous lecture, they don't have any bearing on the truth of the claim or the logical strength, if you will, if it's an argument, or its validity if it's a deductive argument, right? Strictly speaking, it never has any bearing on that. We might be a little bit more hesitant if we're dealing with an alcoholic father, right, to maybe be a little bit more suspicious of what they might say, all things considered, but we can never just dismiss, right, any of their arguments out of hand just because we know they're an alcoholic father or they speed, at least 10 miles per hour over the speed limit every time they drive, right? Regardless of what the negative feature is, we always have to go in and analyze whatever it is they're saying for what it is in and of itself. Okay, turning to slide 5, we'll get into then the subtypes of ad hominem fallacies. First, we'll talk about, I alluded to this one with a previous example already, the idea of poisoning the well. So this is a specific type of ad hominem fallacy where the suggestion is don't buy into whatever the person's going to say in the future. Right? The whole idea is it's future-oriented. It's seeking to discredit what a person or some entity is going to suggest at some later point in time. Okay. So I like it's words from 213 of the 10th edition. Quote, we must be extra careful not to reject what a person says just because we have an unfavorable impression of the individual, end quote. Again, we can never be sure when we've been unduly influenced by others, right, in this negative way, right? Has the well been poisoned and we just haven't realized it? Right? Do we have maybe some of our negative impressions that we have of a speaker because of what other people have suggested beforehand, right? The whole idea here is we need to be on guard against that sort of thing and always assess, again, what the person, the speaker, says in this case, for what he's saying at the time, right, or she's saying at the time. So I'll give you an example. You may as well tune out whatever the keynote speaker says tomorrow, hence future-oriented. He's a JCC professor, again, professor-oriented example. And JCC professors are known for being a little out there, end quote. Again, it's dismissing, given some quality of the character, in this case, future-oriented, that's why it's poisoning the well, dismissing whatever it is they're going to say, or it's suggesting we ought to, okay? Never the case. We always have to consider what it actually is they're saying. Turning to slide 6, I wanted to mention a type that I could be wrong here. Just read this, I reread it again. I don't remember them going through this in this edition, but they did in previous editions, and I don't know why they would drop it, but there's also, so typically ad hominems are offered in a negative sense. The person, whoever's offering, are guilty of the ad hominem and hoping to elicit certain conclusions on our part, but we're being critical thinkers, we're going to recognize that. Right? Whoever is typically doing that, it's in a negative sense, usually. But the point of slide 6, we also have, it's not always the case, right? We also have what are known as positive ad hominems. These work in a similar vein, in a similar way. The idea is there's something about the character that then leads us to dismiss, or in this case, endorse unduly a particular argument or a particular perspective or position they have. Right, when it's never the character traits, whether positive or negative, that should have any bearing on our reaction to their positions on issues. It should be the positions themselves, right, or what they're saying in defense of those positions, the arguments or lack thereof. That's always, right, what we as logical and critical thinkers should be focused on. Okay, so getting to slide 6 then. Just acknowledging at the top there that most of the time we run into an ad hominem. You probably heard the phrase, that's an ad hominem. Well, now we know what an ad hominem is here. Most of the time, again, it is in that negative sense, but the point here in slide 6 is it can happen in that positive sense. Again, you always have to address and analyze what the person's saying in and of itself, right? So imagine my example down at the bottom. You're so enamored with your logic instructor that you just find yourself immediately sort of endorsing, right, when there's discussions about that logic instructor's positions on various issues, immediately sort of coming to his or her defense. If that's the case, well, you're probably guilty of a positive ad hominem. You're letting your positive overall feelings of the instructor sort of sway, right, your position with respect to their positions on all these various issues without taking the requisite time to actually address the issues and the positions that articulated by the instructor themselves, right? You have to go through and actually, again, analyze what it is here that instructor is saying, he or she is saying. Okay, let's move on. Slide 7. Now, this isn't, it's a genetic fallacy. This isn't towards a person per se, but again, it's suggesting something problematic about the source, right? Of what's being sort of offered, as if that's immediately licensed for us to dismiss what's being offered, right? We always have to analyze what's being offered. There's no other, right? We can never just dismiss from a logical perspective the arguments being offered because of anything to do with their source. And so that's what all these ad hominem fallacies have to do with, right? We're taking out the source, including the genetic fallacy. We're taking out the source rather than what's being said or what's being offered in and of itself. So, top of slide 7, someone is guilty of a genetic fallacy when he or she tries to refute a claim solely on the basis of something that happened in the past. So, what does that mean exactly? Hence, this type of person that's guilty of this argue, quote, that the origin of a contention in and of itself automatically renders it false, end quote. And that's from 188. And that's, again, never the case. So, imagine someone saying, for example, I like their quote on 188. Quote, where on earth did you hear that? On talk radio? End quote. As if just the fact that the person heard it from talk radio, right, that was the source, immediately. Now, oftentimes you want to maybe be a little more suspicious if the source was talk radio, as we talked about when we talked about credibility, right? Granted, you might be a little bit more suspicious, but you can't just immediately, again, dismiss a claim just because it originated, right, it was originally heard on talk radio. It might still nevertheless be true. Okay, so the suggestion here is, right, hey, if that was the source, you can just immediately dismiss it. No. Again, you always still have to go in and address whether it's true or false. So such examples, again, from page 188, quote, imply that a view should be rejected simply because of its origin or genesis, and that's, end quote, and that's, again, never the case. So that was our discussion of argumentum ad hominem or ad hominem fallacies. We've done one. Let's move on to straw man, a term that or a phrase that you've probably heard of, again, maybe at some point, but maybe you weren't quite sure what exactly it amounted to. So top of slide 8. This fallacy occurs, quote, when a speaker or writer attempts to dismiss a contention by distorting or misrepresenting it, end quote. So here, the issue is whatever the person's saying, it isn't actually relevant because what they painted as the other person's position isn't actually that person's position. So no matter what the person then says, since they painted whatever the opposition is, okay, they've suggested, right, they've misrepresented the opposition's position in such a manner that it doesn't matter what they say anymore because it's not addressing what was originally claimed in the first place, right? Rather, it's a misrepresentation of what was originally said. It's a straw man. It's not the real man. It's a straw man. So this fallacy, as I mentioned in the middle bullet point on slide 8, this fallacy derives its name from the fact that it can be much easier to defeat or rebut the opposition's position, right, when it's skewed, when it's misrepresented, because typically when it's misrepresented, it's done in an extreme fashion, in a way that's, very obviously like nobody would endorse, right, that position, right, because it's not really the person's actual position, right? The person that's guilty of the straw man, they've misrepresented it, again, in such an extreme fashion that, again, the idea is, well, most of us would, right, not knowing any better, we're going to reject then the opposition's position, right, because we've been given instead, not the real position, but such an extreme misrepresentation of it. So maybe some examples would be good here. But by the way, I like that they pointed out 216 from the 10th edition, the whole idea behind the straw man fallacy. Right, quote, a man made of straw is easier to knock over than a real one, end quote. So that's typically when the person engaged in a straw man fallacy, what they're up to is they want to make it easier to get everyone else on board with their position. And so that's done fairly easily if you completely misrepresent in an extreme fashion the opposition. Right, so imagine, again, I think some examples help with respect to the straw man fallacy. Imagine someone says to us, don't vote for Joe Blow, or Joe Doe in this case. He's for legalizing everything. But then we find out, right? We don't know any different. And somebody says, don't vote for Joe Doe. Their platform is for legalizing everything. Well, if we don't know any better, and that's what we're given, and that's what we think Joe Doe's platform is, we're not going to vote for Joe Doe unless we're anarchists. Right? But lo and behold, in fact, Mr. Doe, as I point out at the bottom of slide 8, he was only for legalizing gambling or marijuana or prostitution or whatever the case was, right? Only, certain particular one or two things. Well, had we known that, maybe we would have voted for Mr. Doe in this instance, right? But instead, again, we were given that exaggerated extreme representation, and again, it was much easier than to refute Mr. Doe in this case because it was not actually his position. It was an extreme misrepresentation of it. Moving on to slide 9, another good example. So this is from, as I mentioned at the top of slide 9, this example is from the 10th edition, the previous one I used. So imagine the editor's wife. So this is from 216 of the 10th edition. The editor's wife remarking, "Mark, it's time you got busy and cleaned out the garage." And then the editor responds, Mark responds, "What, again? Do I have to clean out the garage every blasted day?" So the editor's response, right, entails a straw man, right? The implication is, in fact, that Mark, the editor, never seems to clean out the garage. She says, after all, it's time, right? As if you never have done it yet. Get out there and finally do it. All right, but he responds as if she not only is just asking for the first time, right, or to do it for the first time, but as if she's asking him to do it all the time, which would clearly be ridiculous, right? Nobody should be required to clean a garage every day, right? So we would be much more likely to sympathize with Mark or the editor and think her position was extreme if that was what it actually was. But no, he's given us a misrepresentation of her actual position. Can you just clean it this one time finally, Mark, please? Okay, so another good example, I think, of the straw man fallacy. So that was slide 9. Go ahead and mark that off our list, our catalog. So the next one, again, probably one you've heard of, come across at various points in your life. It's what's known as a false dilemma, and we'll have the various versions that we'll go through here in a moment. But first, we'll kind of carve out what it is in general here. So the top slide 10 here, as they mentioned on page 218 of the 10th edition, the false dilemma, quote, occurs when you limit considerations to only 2 alternatives, although other alternatives may be available. Right, so the general idea is they suggest, hey, look, it's either this or this, when in fact there's a third or a fourth or 10 million other options, right, that they're not acknowledging. So you commit this fallacy, this is from page 189 of the 13th edition, you commit this fallacy if you try, quote, to establish a conclusion by offering it as the only alternative to something we will find unacceptable, unattainable, or implausible, end quote. And basically what they're getting at there, and is generally when these false dilemmas are offered, right, oftentimes, right, the one so extreme, well, then this is the only viable option, right? That's what they're getting at here. And oftentimes we should be leery of cases where that is the situation, and where the suggestion is, hey, the opposite is so crazy, right? We have only this option. You have to go with this. And no, again, the idea with the false dilemma is there's at least a third, if not a fourth, if not 10 billion other equally viable possible alternatives. But what I was trying to suggest here is that a lot of times when this happens, right, the other alternative that's then given, besides the one they want you to come to, is typically extreme. Right? To the point where you'd have no, if those really were the only options, well, of course you'd take the one they want you to take. Okay, so this is the middle of slide 10. Another example from 189. They have a lot of examples with cleaning out the garage, it seems. Quote, look, either we clean out the garage or this junk will run us out of house and home. Granted, it'd be nice to clean out the garage. There are other alternatives. Right? We don't have to immediately clean it out. We could stop buying other stuff. Right? So we don't necessarily have to clean out the garage right now. Right? We could clean it later, or we could, we don't have to necessarily clean the garage right now or be run out of house and home right now, right? We could either clean it later, right, or we could stop accumulating junk at all, right? And so then henceforth it won't matter because we're not bringing any more stuff in. These are other options. The whole point is these are other options that aren't being considered here. I think the bottom bullet point, I don't remember them mentioning this in the 13th edition, but I think it's important to illuminate here that false dilemmas aren't necessarily always captured in the either or fashion. Okay, they can just as easily be captured in the if-then fashion. Right? If we don't clean up the garage immediately, then we'll be run out of house and home. Okay, well, again, that's the same false dilemma on offer here. It's just couched in slightly different verbiage. So that's the point at the very bottom of slide 10. You can find false dilemmas phrased in different fashions, right? In different ways other than just the either this or this. Right? Oftentimes, if not X, then Y will be the case. Okay, that's also, if in fact there are other options, right? Then that's also then a false dilemma. Okay, so that's our discussion of false dilemma in general. Turning to slide 11, I wanted to discuss a particular type or sort of false dilemma known as the perfectionist fallacy. As I mentioned on the top of slide 11, coming from page 190 of the 13th edition, this sort of false dilemma is a sort of false dilemma that, quote, is committed when a speaker or writer ignores options between perfection and nothing. So, right, the whole idea is either it has to be perfect or it won't work at all. Well, what about improving it in general? Okay, so the general theme with respect to perfectionist fallacy is whoever is guilty of this, they have it in their mind that something has to be perfect or it won't work, when in fact there are other intermediary possibilities, right? Why not improve something? Even though it might not be ever perfect, why not improve it to whatever degree you can? And actually, I like the example, they had mentioned this in a previous edition, I don't remember what edition. Then I remember, so I'm old enough that I can remember in the NFL, football, when they didn't have replay and when they were first discussing the possibility of implementing instant replay, I remember these kinds of debates. I remember this argument vividly. Well, you can't see everything, right? You'll never see every angle and what's going on, as if then that should be a reason to not adopt instant replay at all. The inference being, right, or the implication being that if it's not perfect, don't do it at all. Well, again, why not get a few more calls right? Granted, we might not be able to get all the calls right on the field even after replay. At least maybe we could get a few more of them right. Now, granted, there's a whole slew of other problems related to instant replay, as we've discovered now that we've had it for decades, right? Like the fact that games take even longer than they already otherwise would. And of course, a lot of that's due to the commercialism as well. But anyway, I mean, I think that's a great example of the perfectionist fallacy that I remember very vividly and remember thinking that's a terrible argument at the time, right? Because again, just because you can't get something perfect doesn't mean you shouldn't strive to be as good as you can possibly be at it. Okay, bottom point there in slide 11 often pertains to like policies or plans that are in dispute. Should we implement it or not? Right, they're being debated. Much like again the NFL instant replay policy was being debated whether or not they should implement instant replay. And it often takes the following form. This is from the 10th edition, page 221. Quote, if policy X will not meet our goals as well as we'd like them met, i.e. perfectly, then policy X should be rejected, end quote. Again, why need that necessarily be the case? There might be all kinds of better options than don't do it at all. Just because you can't have perfection, there might still be all these other intermediary options that are still better. Granted, we can't have perfection. It's still better than the other option. Okay. Slide 12. Another version, so we talked about perfectionist fallacy. Another version of the false dilemma is what's known as the line drawing fallacy. As I mentioned towards the top of slide 12, this comes from page 222 of the 10th edition. The line drawing fallacy is, quote, the fallacy of insisting that a line must be drawn at some precise point when in fact it is not necessary that such a precise line be drawn, end quote. Okay, so the idea is it's a false dilemma because the person is suggesting, at least in these instances where this is applicable, that hey, since we can't draw a line anywhere definitively, then there must not exist, or there can't be a line drawn at all. All right, so when in fact, hey, it's kind of like a perfectionist fallacy in a way, right? Because we can't find a perfect place to draw the line, don't draw the line at all. And the idea is, well, we might need to draw a line regardless, right? Anyway, right? And again, to insist on having a perfect place to be able to draw the line, that would be a fallacy in those instances. So kind of capturing those points, a middle quote this is from page 222 of the 10th edition. This suggests then that, quote, either there is a precise place where we draw the line or else there's no line to be drawn. No difference between one end of the scale and the other. Again, just because we can't, the whole idea is just because we can't definitively demarcate where one thing stops being one thing and becomes another. And we'll give examples here where this becomes, I think, sort of makes the point maybe a little clearer. It doesn't mean that the one thing isn't the other thing, right? That there isn't a difference nonetheless. So again, examples will help here in a second. Bottom quote from page 190 of the 13th edition. Quote, this fallacy occurs when a speaker or writer assumes that either a crystal clear line can be drawn between two things or else there is no difference between them. Again, the idea is it's not always necessary to be able to draw a precise line or precise point, okay, in order to get by, or to, sometimes you have to be able to draw a line nonetheless. So I think a good example that, again, they dropped for some reason, which I really thought illustrated the point well, this was discussed in the 10th edition, was, so back in the 1990s, there were riots in response to the verdict when Rodney King was an individual who was beaten by police, and then as a result of the verdict, when the police were then later put on trial, the verdict being not guilty, then there's massive riots in Los Angeles, historic riots. And anyway, so the example is in reference to that, to a juror who was in that case. So this comes from 221 of the 10th edition. And so it's in reference to the Rodney King case. So the juror's thinking was the first time King was struck with a nightstick did not constitute excessive force, right? So imagine the police officer hitting Rodney King with a nightstick. The first time, okay, look, maybe circumstances warranted it, right? The idea was we wouldn't automatically construe that as excessive force, okay? So that wasn't excessive force. So the line of thinking was, well, which of the 50 times, right? So I don't know the exact number, but the implication here is Rodney King was beaten, 50 plus times by the nightstick. So at what point then did it become excessive force? Okay, it wasn't with strike one. Well, was it strike two then? Well, no, we can imagine 2 strikes being necessary, maybe, yada, yada, yada. Well, right, the whole idea was, well, we know that they got to 50 plus. And the point here is, look, granted, 1 or 2, that might not be excessive force. But we know, right, we want to be able to say at the very least, let's put it that way, that hitting someone 50 plus times with a nightstick, that constitutes excessive force. Granted, we might not be able to pick out, and this is the whole idea, where exactly or which time exactly. We don't have an exact point at which to put the line or draw the line. Granted, that's the case. We still want to be able to find people guilty in this example. Okay, but again, the juror, so the implication here is, right, from this edition, that the juror was guilty of the line drawing fallacy. His or her, I don't remember, what gender, it doesn't matter, the juror was, right? But the whole line of thinking, well, it's because I can't draw a perfect, I don't have a line. I don't know exactly, right, perfectly where to put the line. Well, then how can I say, right, that one side is excessive and the other side is not when I don't know where this line is? Okay. The idea is, look, you still have to draw a line in this case, and to not do so would be a mistake. Okay, so that was the bottom of slide 13. That takes care of our discussion of false dilemma. We'll move on then to the fourth major category, if you will, of relevance fallacies, what's known as misplacing the burden of proof. So this comes from page 224 of the 10th edition, the top of slide 14. Quote, misplacing the burden of proof occurs when the burden of proof is placed on the wrong side of an issue. End quote. Next quote there, also from 224 of the 10th edition. Quote, people are frequently tricked into thinking that they have to prove their opponent's claim wrong when in fact the opponent should be proving that the claim is right, end quote. And for me, this sort of thing, the best kind of example I can envision for this sort of thing happens all the time, like when you're in a, not necessarily heated, but a back and forth discussion about something that's kind of intense with like, a friend or something, and next thing you know, you find yourself like, just like they're saying, like trying to prove why your friend's claim is false when in fact they should be, in this case, proving that it's true. All right, this happens all the time, I feel like, and especially in, like I was saying, in more intense discussions, it can sort of slip in, and oftentimes, we'll be then when we shouldn't be required to, we'll be sort of doing something that we again shouldn't have to before we know it, right? Because it's slipped in there, given the intensity of this discussion and so on. So I guess the whole point was this can very easily happen, right? This misplacing of the burden of proof and go completely unnoticed, right? You can find yourself, defending or addressing or trying to reject certain claims when you shouldn't really have to, or maybe you are the one getting other people to do things they shouldn't have to in those sorts of debates. Anyway, so again, people are frequently tricked into thinking they have to prove their opponent's claim wrong, when in fact the opponent should be proving that the claim is right? And then vice versa might happen as well. So how do we determine kind of, who has the burden of proof? This is something that can be debated in itself. There's kind of 3 things to keep in mind, at least from what I gather, that we'll discuss here. So the first thing I mentioned on the bottom of slide 14, this comes from the authors discuss it on page 193. This comes down to this idea of initial credibility. It's very similar to our discussion of initial plausibility when we were discussing the idea of credibility in lecture 8 or chapter 4 of the text. There's that idea of initial plausibility, right? Claims either have initial plausibility or not. And when they don't have the initial plausibility, well, we'll become more suspicious of them, right? Was the whole idea back then. We'll have a similar concept here when it comes to figuring out who has the burden of proof, who should be, right, all things being equal, who should then have to sort of defend their position, right, or argue for their side, start off arguing for their side. Again, this idea of initial credibility reflects the similar concept of initial plausibility that we discussed previously. So this is how the authors put it on 193 of our text. Quote, speaking generally, if the issue is a factual one, the side making the more outlandish claim, the claim having the lowest initial credibility, has the burden of proof. So we have to kind of make this initial assessment, right? Whose position entails the more outlandish claim? Of course, maybe this is going to just be disputed, right? Well, I think his position, right, is the more outlandish one, and he or she's going to think mine is, but right, insofar as this is possible, right, if the issue is a factual one, and the one that seems to be making all things being equal, a more outlandish claim, well, then they would have the burden of proof to be supporting they ought to be supporting their position. We ought not to be trying to say why their position is wrong, right? They need to support their position instead. Okay, then they point out, the authors do on page 193, another thing to consider, and that's like, they put it in terms of so this is slide 15, who is recommending change from the status quo? All other things being equal, whoever's recommending, right, if there's no other way to decide, for example, who has the burden of proof, put it on the person who is recommending change, right, who wants to stray from the status quo. So as they put it from page 193, quote, other things being equal, the burden of proof falls on the person who wants to change something rather than the person who wants to leave things alone, end quote. I was kind of thinking about that. I think that's probably generally true, but I don't know that that's, again, maybe this is where the other things being equal comes in, but I don't know that that's necessarily always true, but yeah, the idea here in any case is that, again, the person, if you're trying to decide, well, who has the burden of proof, the person who is recommending a different course of action or recommending change, put it on them. So they gave the example, this is from 192, someone saying guns should be outlawed. I'll bet you can't think of a single good reason they shouldn't. So imagine someone's position, guns shouldn't be outlawed. And then they say, this is again how a shifty way of trying to misplace the burden of proof, right? Trying to get the opposition then to say why they shouldn't be outlawed. Well, again, the idea is currently guns aren't outlawed, and written in the Constitution is the idea that we should have the right to protect ourselves with guns. So the change would be to outlaw the guns. So the idea then is, considering general reflection 2 here, the person wanting to recommend change, straying from the status quo, in this case, outlawing guns, they should be the ones defending their position. But again, see what they're trying to do. I'll bet you can't think of a single good reason they shouldn't be outlawed. See, they're trying to shift the burden of proof to the other person. Tell me why guns shouldn't be outlawed. And no, they should be saying why guns should be outlawed. Or at least that's the suggestion. Okay, and then the third and final thing to consider, and they mention this, but I don't think they focus on it as much as they did in previous editions. So as I mentioned there at the bottom, this comes from page 226 of the 10th edition. Quote, sometimes getting at the truth is not the only thing we want to accomplish, and on such occasions we may purposely place the burden of proof on a particular side, end quote. We don't only want to just get at the truth. Well, yes, there are cases, right? Not everybody is just solely concerned with philosophy, right, and truth. What they have in mind, great example, what we mean here is courts of law, okay? Yes, we want the truth, but we also want other things, like, for example, we don't want to let guilty people go free, but we don't want, innocent people to be imprisoned either. Okay? So these are other things that we also care about. And so, for example, then in courts of law, the burden of proof isn't equal on the prosecution and defense, right? No, the prosecution has a much heavier burden of proof because we would rather, I guess the idea is, right, we would rather have some guilty people go free than imprison innocent people, right? So that's why then we make it harder, right? The prosecution has a tougher job, right? More of the burden of proof is on them, right, to make a case, right? Because again, we care more we care about more than just the truth, or at least with respect to some things or some contexts. Like in court of law, again, we're very much afraid of, I think this is generally true, of enslaving or imprisoning people that are innocent. Okay, so that was misplacing the burden of proof. Begging the question. So this is one that you probably all heard, but the authors alluded to this. A lot of times, colloquially, when we hear the phrase, that begged the question, it just means, well, that brought up, that begged the question of blah, blah, blah. Well, they just mean that brought up whatever. Well, that's not what we mean here, and traditionally, that's not what begging the question meant. Instead, what we mean to indicate by begging the question is that there's a fallacy, right? There was a mistake being made. And specifically, what happens with begging the question is when the person offers the argument, their premise, their reason, in fact, isn't really a reason at all, because it already presupposes, and in some cases even just restates the conclusion itself. Right? So it's not really relevant evidence in that case. It's just already presupposing, or in some cases even restating, the conclusion they want to convince us of. So it's begging the question in that sense. It hasn't done anything, right? It's just the person that disagrees with this is going to just disagree with this, right? Because again, the issue when somebody begs the question is they're already presupposing the evidence itself presupposes the truth of the conclusion, or sometimes even restates, just is a different way of restating the same conclusion. Right? So, top of slide 16. This occurs when the person advancing a claim or conclusion regarding an issue employs premises that presuppose the truth of the claim or conclusion itself. So, fairly common example that was also mentioned by the authors. Say someone's trying to prove the existence of God, and they rely on Scripture as evidence. Well, look, that's going to be, if that's your evidence, the person who doesn't believe in God, I mean, that's not going to do any good either, right? Because relying on Scripture or what the Bible says or whatever, and suggesting, well, hey, whatever Scripture says is true because it's the Word of God, as if then that's evidence. Well, that's going to be equally problematic, because what makes Scripture's evidence for us, right, is supposing that it's the Word of God, and which presupposes that God exists in the first place, right? So their evidence in that case already presupposes the truth of their conclusion. So no one, right, who has an issue with their conclusion is going to accept that as a premise. They're going to have just as much of an issue with citing Scripture as a reason to believe that God exists, right, as the very notion that God exists in the first place. So that's again the example I get into then. When asked how they know God exists, such people that are guilty of that type of mistake, begging the question in this fashion. Some say that it's because the Scriptures clearly indicate that God exists, right, and that the Scriptures are inspired by God Himself, so what they say must be true. But again, right, that's presupposing God exists in the first place, which was what you're trying to be supporting, okay, not presupposing. Okay, so that was slide 16, and that is begging the question. A phrase you've no doubt heard. Now, whether or not it was expressed in the correct, or at least in the traditional sense, that's another thing. But we'll go ahead and move on to a big one. Appeal to emotion. Very, very big. In fact, we have several subtypes here. This is one we talked at length about rhetoric, right? In the previous lecture. So at this point in the course, we are on guard against emotions that are conjured up when we have on our logician and critical thinker caps, right? And when that's what we're concerned with, right? Coming to the truth about things and analyzing arguments for their logical merit in and of itself, we know to be on guard against our emotions that might be conjured up. Good, bad, positive, negative. So, same sort of thing, right? We've already talked about the impact of rhetoric and emotion and so on. Well, all of these relevance fallacies play on those emotions, and so we'll see how that's the case as we go through some of these. Okay? But the general idea, right, the general term for all these subtypes then
right here is there it appeals to emotion, right? What's being offered as evidence, the pseudo reasoning, is actually not evidence at all, right? It's pseudo, right? And in this case, in all these cases, it's feelings instead of an actual reason, right? Instead, what's being offered is feelings are being conjured up, and that's being substituted for a legitimate reason. And that, I believe, is the middle of slide 17, coming from page 195 for the point of the authors. The common denominator in all varieties of this fallacy is that, quote, a speaker or writer supports a contention by playing on our emotions rather than by producing a real argument, end quote. So as I mentioned, be sure to know all the following then that we'll go through here. So let's start with argument from outrage. It's pretty straightforward. The idea is, in this case, they want us to come to a certain conclusion, and so they make us really mad. They get us really angry about stuff, right? And then that, rather than actual reason for endorsing a position on an issue, that will nevertheless be effective oftentimes, right? As for all the reasons we talked about in previous lectures, right? That emotion will then get us to this place, and they don't need an actual reason, right? Assuming, right, we're not critical thinkers and we don't recognize that what they've done is actually just offered us an argument from outrage. So really, this should probably be in quotes, right? They're not really offering us an argument. They're just conjuring up this anger and substituting that for an actual reason. So, as I mentioned, top of slide 18, someone who commits this fallacy, quote, attempts to convince us by making us angry rather than by giving us a relevant argument, end quote. That's from 194 of the 13th edition. It, quote, consists of inflammatory words or thoughts followed by a conclusion of some sort, end quote. That's from 186 of the 10th edition. So again, it capitalizes on feelings of anger, which is going to then unduly sway us to adopt certain positions that we otherwise wouldn't have, if it's effective. So I'll give you some examples there. Just because you're angry about a particular candidate's stance on abortion or the death penalty doesn't mean that you should just reject their overall platform, right? That they don't have good positions or with respect to different issues, or that maybe even their arguments, maybe you don't ultimately agree with abortion or the death penalty, but maybe they nevertheless have good arguments, right? So your anger towards them for having a certain stance on a particular issue, right? That should never, again, sway you in such a way that you don't nevertheless assess, right, their positions and their arguments for what they are. You still always have to go in and evaluate what they're saying with respect to all these different issues. Right? You can't let that anger be the deciding factor, or at least not if you're being a good logician and critical thinker. Okay. What's more, this comes from 186 of the 10th edition. Quote, we may let the, I already said that, sorry. Bottom points, bottom bullet point, I meant to say on slide 18, talks about mention this very briefly, a type of argument from outrage, which is, again, is a type of appeal to emotion, which again is a type of relevance fallacy. So scapegoating is a kind of argument from outrage where, right, someone makes us really mad about stuff and then pins it all on a particular person or cause, right, or a particular group of people, right, saying all these problems that we're really mad about are they're to blame for. So I'll give you an example, Hitler's treatment of the Jewish people, there at the bottom. Okay. Moving on to slide 19, our next example of appeal to emotion. We'll discuss scare tactics. And this involves, as I mentioned on the top of slide 19, quote, trying to scare people into doing something or accepting a position, end quote, and reflects the fact that, quote, when people become angry or afraid, they don't think clearly, end quote. Page 188 of the 10th edition. Actually, I just bought a book on the science of fear. It sounded really interesting. So this, which gets into all this kind of thing, which is why these are so effective, right? How when we are fearful, right, we do things and believe things that we otherwise would never think or believe. So fear, and then, as we've already mentioned, anger, right, getting mad about stuff. These feelings are very, very powerful. And so this comes from 188 of the 10th edition. Remember that, quote, if the idea is to get people to substitute fear for reason and judgment when taking a position on an issue, it's a fallacy. Again, we always have to go in and analyze what's being said, or the position itself, right, or the arguments themselves. And we ought not to be unduly swayed by, in this case, the fear, right, that might have been conjured up by all the things that the person we're talking with said. Imagine, so their example 195, imagine someone saying, Gavin Newsom is a terrible governor. Do you seriously think I could be interested in being your girlfriend if you support him? End quote. Right? So they haven't actually given a reason why Gavin Newsom's a terrible governor. Instead, they're trying to conjure up fear, right, and get in this case, the possibly significant other, right, to buy into this idea of Gavin Newsom's a terrible governor just based on that fear that was conjured up rather, right, than actual reasons. Slide 20, then I mentioned particular types of scare tactics. If there's actual threat of force at play, well, that's known as an argument by force, right? So they're conjuring up fear, and there's actually a threat at play, then that's known as an argument by force. Right? If you know what's good for you, I'll give you a good reason you'll be home by curfew. But if not, you'll get swatted on the butt or something like that, right? Or whatever the case may be. You'll get a beating. Imagine a parent saying, all right, that's an argument by force. It's a threat, direct threat. Okay? It's a type, and it's substituting again as if that's actually a reason from a logical perspective to be home by curfew. No, I mean, that's not actually a reason. You're just threatening them, right, with the use of force to be home on time, to obey curfew. Okay, so that's a particular type of scare tactics. Then another example of scare tactics is known as the peer pressure fallacy. So again, you are buy into doing or believing something not because you have a good reason to, but because you fear being ostracized if you don't, right? The feelings of belonging, it's very powerful. We all want to belong, and conversely then, the threat of not belonging, that sort of feeling, right, being ostracized, that's very powerful. And so someone playing off that, trying to get that and use that as a substitute for an actual reason, right? If that's the case, then that is, that's an illustration of a peer pressure fallacy. So one commits, let me start with the middle bullet point on slide 20. It's another version of scare tactics that occurs when our desire for acceptance leads us to accept a claim that is otherwise logically unsupported, or when we use this desire for acceptance to try and sway others. So one commits this fallacy, quote, so one who commits this fallacy, quote, is simply trying to make the listener fear being made an outcast, end quote. So they don't actually give, that's from 196. They don't actually give a good reason, actual evidence from a logician's perspective. They just play on, again, that fear of being ostracized. So I'll give you an example at the very bottom of slide 20. Back in my day, this would have been much more the case. I don't know that this is much the case. Back in my day growing up, I should say, as a youth, this was would have much more been the case. I don't know that it's the case anymore, but imagine someone back in my early youth, at least, saying, "Yo, Tommy, everybody knows it ain't cool for guys to wear pink shirts. You'll be the laughingstock of the whole school if you wear that." End quote. I should have worn a pink shirt for this, but I didn't. Anyway, right, so the whole idea there is you're not actually given a reason, a good reason, or any reason at all, from a logician's perspective, not to wear the pink shirt. Rather, they're playing on the fear, right, of what might happen if you wear the pink shirt to then not wear the pink shirt, right? They haven't actually given us a reason from a logical perspective that pink shirts are bad or that you shouldn't wear the pink shirt. Rather, look what's going to happen. How are you going to feel, right, when no one wants to be around you? So that peer pressure, the old peer pressure, issue of peer pressure. So that sort of scenario, whoever gave that argument, call him Billy, right, he would have been guilty of a peer pressure fallacy. Okay, so that was slide 20. Moving on to slide 21, we'll move on to our next type of appeal to emotion, and here we're dealing with pity, another kind of emotion. So here, quoting page 189 of the 10th edition, our quote, feeling sorry for someone drives us to a position on an unrelated matter, end quote. And then the next quote from 196, it, quote, occurs when a speaker or writer tries to convince us of something by arousing our pity rather than by giving a relevant argument, end quote. So, I think they might have given a similar example in the text, but, right, you are trying to maybe get a nanny and you're trying to figure out who to hire. And so imagine a husband and wife, and say the wife says, well, we should not hire Esmeralda because her and her kids have been starving and she needs the support. Okay, well, that might be true, and it definitely stinks, and we certainly don't want others to be starving and so on and so forth. But that in itself, right, she might still be a terrible nanny. Maybe her kids are in terrible shape, in part because she is a terrible nanny, right? Or would make such a terrible nanny, right? Because she has those certain characteristics, right? That's in part why maybe she's in such a bad spot. Not to say that's the case, right? But the whole idea here is that in itself is not a valid reason from a logician's perspective to then hire her as a nanny, right? Just because we pity her circumstances, right? No, we need to know more, right? And to allow those feelings of pity to then unduly sway us, right, and to hire her on the spot as a result, that would be a mistake. Right? And we need to know, in this case, what are her actual qualities as a nanny. Okay, so that was appeal to pity. And then on the final slide with respect to appeal to emotion, slide 22, we'll just go through a few others. Okay? So basically any kind of emotion you can think of, right? All these emotions are very powerful, and they can be used in a way as a sort of surrogate reason, right? Pseudo reasoning or pseudo reason in an argument, hence not really an argument, right? And be a kind of mistake then. Any kind of emotion you can think of in some sense. So we'll start with appeal to envy or jealousy. As I mentioned, so this is from page 190 of the 10th edition. Here, quote, we find fault with the person because of envy, end quote. So imagine you're really, you are jealous of someone because they make a lot of money, right? And they apply for a different job despite making a lot of money already, and we're super jealous. And we say something like, we know somebody on the hiring committee, and we say something like, you shouldn't give her the job. She already makes over 6 figures a year, end quote. And if that jealousy is what sort of arousing that sentiment, again, she might be a great candidate nevertheless, right? No matter how much money she already makes or has made, she still might be a great candidate for the job. So whoever's on the hiring committee, and we ourselves, right, if we were more astute, we should look into those things that actually matter, right? Next one is apple polishing. This is a classic one I really enjoy when you come across it. So this amounts to, quote, allowing praise of oneself to substitute for judgment about the truth of a claim, or trying to get others to do this. So that was from 190 to 191 of the 10th edition. So in other words, plays on feelings of pride, right? We all like to feel really good about ourselves. And so someone who's polishing the apple, so to speak, will play on the fact that people like, right, to feel good about themselves. So imagine someone saying, since you and I are both intelligent, you will easily understand the merits of socialism, at least on paper. We like the idea of feeling intelligent, and someone stroking our ego like that. Right? And if that kind of ego stroking or apple polishing then gets us to immediately just sort of adopt socialism or become more sympathetic to it without really analyzing its merits, well then we will be susceptible to fall prey to apple polishing. Right? We'd be making a mistake. In addition to the person, saying the thing itself, right? If we fall victim to it, then we're equally making a mistake. Now, again, socialism might be, in fact, great, right? But the whole point is you have to actually go in and analyze it. Right? You can't just let those feelings, right, get you on board with it without actually going in and investigating it. And then finally, there's what's known as guilt tripping, one of my favorites probably, just because of all the emails I get. Actually, they've kind of, it seems like I don't get them quite as much as I used to, but pretty, almost like clockwork, pretty regularly, maybe once a semester at least, the emails I get from students that are guilty of this guilt tripping. So, well, first, bottom of slide 22, what is guilt tripping? This is from 191 of the 10th edition. Eliciting feelings of guilt to get others to do or not to do something, or to adopt the view that they should or should not do it. And again, you're letting those feelings of guilt, the whole idea is the person guilt tripping you wants those feelings of guilt, right, to get you to do something or believe something, rather than offering an actual reason to believe or think or do something, right? They're playing off that guilt. So imagine someone saying, but surely you wouldn't fire me over this. How many times have I worked overtime when you needed me to, and you'd force my entire family out onto the streets? Well, look, those would all be terrible circumstances, right? And, I wouldn't feel great about that. But, hey, maybe you should still be fired if you've stolen, $10 million from the company in the last year. So, there's a good example. But like I said, what do I mean by emails from students? I have a scholarship, and if I don't get a C in this class, then yada yada yada. Okay, as if that would stink that you don't get your scholarship, or that you can't stay on the team, or whatever the case might be, or you won't maintain your 4.0, right? All that would stink. But if you still didn't get the requisite points, I mean, that is what it is, right? And that's what ultimately matters when it comes to the grade you deserve, right? Is the points you earned, not whether or not, right, you will maintain, membership on certain teams, or maintain scholarships, right? None of that has any bearing on the grade you should receive, right? Rather, it's the points that you've actually earned in the course. So I get emails guilty of guilt tripping fairly regularly. And what's really ironic is when I get them from students in this course towards the end of the semester after they've already had this material. So that's guilt tripping. I think that'll wrap up our discussion of all the various versions of appeal to emotion. So we will turn to slide 23 and move on to what's known as irrelevant conclusions. Again, I think it could have just easily been labeled irrelevant premise, right? Because the idea is we have certain positions or things we want people to believe or do, right? And the issue has been, right, that this isn't actually relevant to this, right? It's feelings or not a relevant consideration in one shape or form, right? It's not pertinent to this then. So why not call all the other ones that don't fit into these other categories just irrelevant premises? Well, I don't know why. Let's call them, they decided, the authors did, irrelevant conclusions. So we're going to join them, despite my misgivings, right? Whether you want to call it irrelevant premise or irrelevant conclusion, it amounts to the same thing, okay? This last category is basically the same sort of issue that we've been discussing, but they don't fall into any of these other categories. Right? So we'll call them in general. So for your homework, for example, if you find one that doesn't fall into any of these others, well, then it's going to be categorized under irrelevant conclusion. Okay? So as I mentioned, top bullet point, we will join the authors and label any relevant fallacy that doesn't fit the aforementioned categories as, quote, the fallacy of irrelevant conclusion, end quote. That's from 198. So a general example, I do like this example, by the way, they give on 198 as well. Quote, I don't think I missed too many classes to pass. My attendance has been much better lately, end quote again. So the issue, whether or not they've missed too many classes to pass, that's the issue, right? And the implication is they want us to conclude, no, they have not. Their position is, I have not missed too many classes to pass. Then what they offer us is, as reason, right, or evidence, is with respect to their attendance recently, right? Their recent attendance has been much better. Well, look, what does that matter? I like the way I put it at the bottom. What does it matter if you've had perfect attendance the past few weeks, the past month, if you missed the entire first 3 months of the course? So again, the overall issue was whether or not you've missed too many classes to pass the course. Bringing up something with respect to a particular time frame in the overall course, in some sense, that's irrelevant, right? Or they're assigning, at the very least, they're assigning way too much weight to it. So that was an example they offered, or a general sort of example of a relevant conclusion. Then I get into turning to slide 24. get into some more common versions then of irrelevant conclusion fallacies. Namely, probably one we've all heard of, wishful thinking. As they say, so this is from 199 of the 13th edition. Wishful thinking, quote, this happens when we forget that wanting something to be true is irrelevant to whether it is true, end quote. In other words, this is from 191 of the 10th edition, quote, we accept or urge acceptance or rejection of a claim simply because it would be pleasant or unpleasant. So imagine, for example, an aspiring novelist, as I mentioned at the bottom of slide 24 here, that lends more credence to the idea that they'll be the next Stephen King simply because they really, 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 really want to. And I think at some level, at some point in our lives, we've probably all been guilty of this, right? We really, 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 really want something to the point where then we sort of start thinking that it's a little bit more realistic than it really is, right? And if that's the case, then we're guilty of wishful thinking. And by the way, I don't know why I didn't mention this one next, but denial is kind of the same thing, except it works in the opposite, right? We sort of reject something because we really, really, really wouldn't want it to be the case. Just because we wouldn't want it to be the case, that unduly influences us then from a logical perspective, and we reject it, even though wanting something not to be the case is never a reason to think that it isn't actually the case. More on denial here in 1 second, but first, top of slide 25, 2 wrongs make a right. Probably one we've heard of. As I mentioned, top of slide 25, this occurs when someone thinks that the wrongful behavior of someone else justifies wrongful behavior from on his or her own part. Oh my gosh, if you have kids, you have definitely had, this, right? So the idea is, was it wrong to hit your sister? Right? Don't tell me your sister hit you first, right? I want to know whether you, in and of that act in and of itself, whether that was wrong, okay? And to bring up this other, right, the other fact, maybe even that she hit you, right? That's irrelevant to whether you should have hit her. At least the general thinking is here. So, but that's kind of a similar case than the other example there listed in the middle of slide 25. Why did I scream at him? Because he screamed at me first, and that wasn't right. So that was the top one. Again, two wrongs make a right. And then I already alluded to denial. It's kind of the flip side of the coin with respect to wishful thinking, right? Just as really, 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 really wanting something to be the case is never actually good reason or evidence for it actually being the case. Just because you really, 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 really want an A doesn't mean that you actually earn an A, right? That's wishful thinking. And to think that, right, to kind of allow your really, 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 really wanting it to unduly sway your perspective and start to the point where you start thinking that you actually deserve it more than you should. That would be wishful thinking, right? Well, denial, very, very similar, except it's the opposite, right? So we really, 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 really don't want something to be the case, or we don't want to believe something. And so that then kind of starts to seep in, and then to the point where we think it's not the case. We really start to think it's not the case, or we don't actually do it, when in fact, right, we don't have good logical reasoning for that. So, as I mentioned, this is from 199. Denial, this is the middle of slide 25. Quote, denial happens when we forget that wanting something to be false is irrelevant to whether it is false, end quote. And so their example from 199. Quote, I'm positive that I didn't miss class as many times as the professor says, and the records show. I just know it. And if you let that feeling of not wanting to be the case, right, constantly thinking about that, if you let that then, again, sort of unduly sway you to the point where you're making claims that you didn't, in fact, miss that many, just because you didn't want to have missed that many, right, that would be a mistake. Or a classic example like smokers, right, who downplay another, or anybody with a bad habit, drinkers, and again, any sort of bad habit. Daughter used to chew her nails, right? Anyone who downplays the significance of that, right, because they really, really, really don't want it to be an issue, or it would be really, really, really painful to try to stop, right? That's indicative of denial.
All right. That is it, I believe, for our catalog of relevance fallacies. We went through all 7 major types here. Before I conclude, though, I do want to echo an important disclaimer that the authors raised, I believe, also towards the end of the chapter. So again, this is chapter 6. This lecture 10 corresponds to chapter 6. And that is, just because you do have emotions being conjured up, that doesn't automatically mean that there is a mistake being made, right? Or that there's a fallacy at hand. Yes, you should be very cautious when emotions are sparked, right? As we've been pointing out over and over and over the last few lectures. But the disclaimer, the point of slide 26 here is that you still, again, have to assess what's being said. Okay? And just because you had fear, right, conjured up, doesn't mean that the person is, in that case, guilty of scare tactics, right? There might actually be a legitimate, argument, an actual argument still being made, right? They might, you might, even when a real argument's presented, you can be made to feel different emotions. That's the point here. So to immediately dismiss something just because there are emotions there, that would also be a mistake for a critical thinker. Okay, because again, valid, good arguments can also conjure up certain emotions. And again, that's the general point here from slide 26. As they say on 197 of the text, quote, you cannot conclude just because someone appears to be trying to scare you or make you angry or feel some other way that he or she has committed a fallacy. And you still have to consider what they're saying and analyze it for its own merits. I like the example they offered, and they gave several other examples in the 13th edition, but I like the one they had in the 10th edition, page 189 of that edition. Imagine someone saying, you should be careful, that snake, it's deadly poisonous. Well, I mean, yeah, deadly poisonous, that strikes fear in us, right? We don't want to die. Poison sounds bad. But just because they've made us feel fearful, that doesn't mean we should dismiss what they're saying. Okay? That's actually, this is a valid argument here, right? If it's a deadly poisonous snake, then we should steer clear of it. And another example they gave that was similar in the 13th edition, right? Someone who's saying you should avoid, driving on the streets tonight. It's super icy, and when it's super icy, people have a lot more fatal accidents. That's striking fear, right, in us. But again, you have an argument here, a pretty good argument, right? Just similar to the snake example. Right? So just because fear has been invoked, or anger has been invoked, or guilt, or whatever, doesn't mean automatically that fallacy, no argument, right? Or not even. So it might mean, right? There might still be not only an argument there, but also a good argument too. So hopefully that makes sense. So again, emotions and feelings, definitely want to be on alert for those, right? When they want to show up on our radar as critical thinkers. But we never take out what someone says and destroy it or dismiss it simply because it shows up on the radar, right? We still want to go in and examine the potential threat because maybe, lo and behold, right, there is still nonetheless a legitimate argument, right, being made, as was illustrated here in those couple of examples. I think that is it. So I will conclude here our discussion of relevance fallacies by putting the chapter 6 homework up here for you. So again, this wraps up our discussion of relevance fallacies. So in our next lecture, so it'll be lecture 11, we'll talk all about induction fallacies. And then lecture 12, we'll cover, so that'll be our next head, the next major category of fallacies. Right, and then we'll finish the section and the course as a whole with lecture 12, where we'll discuss all the other kinds of fallacies that we didn't cover in the first 2 lectures. Specifically ones that deal with like the forms of arguments, and then also language, a lot of language-related fallacies. So that's what's on the horizon. So we've again finished up lecture 10 on the relevance fallacies, and then next time I see you for lecture 11, it'll be for induction fallacies. Fallacies are mistakes related to inductive reasoning. Thank you.